All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Cultural History of Wetlands in Coastal South Carolina webinar. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Maeve Snyder. I'm the training coordinator at the North Inlet Winyah Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is part of the University of South Carolina and located in Georgetown. Our webinar today was developed with partners from Clemson Extension and South Carolina Sea Grant. So I also want to give an opportunity for our planning team to give an introduction. Amy, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Amy Stroney with Clemson University and Clemson Extension. We've been talking about this webinar topic for quite some time, so we're really excited to be here today and to see y'all. So thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Sari with South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we're really excited that we've been able to finally get this webinar off the ground, and we're excited to hear from our speakers. So thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. All right, so before we get started, I'm just going to give us a few reminders and tips. The first is that we are using Zoom webinar today. And you should see a control panel like this at the bottom of your screen. We're not going to use that raise hand function during the webinar, but we do have a Q&A box where you can type any questions. And we definitely encourage you to ask questions. You can put a question in the box anytime throughout the webinar. We're going to get to them during a designated Q&A period, but you can put them in there anytime. If you're having any technical difficulties, I would recommend leaving with that button on the lower right-hand side and rejoining through the same link. That often will clear up issues, but if you still have problems, you can put them in the Q&A and we will do our best to help. All right, so if you are receiving continuing education credits for attending today, a few things that you need to do. One, you need to be present for the whole webinar, and Zoom will give me a report when you join and leave, so I'll know. You also need to complete an evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. At the end, you'll receive a link to the survey. When you fill that out at the end, there will be another link to click where you can download the certificate. And then you will need to fill in your name and submit that certificate to your professional association. Please don't forward that link. And also please note, we can't give a certificate if you are dialed in on a phone because I can't connect that to who is attending. So if you're on the phone, you can still stay on the phone, but you also need to log in on a device with a screen. All right, so a quick overview of our webinar today. Again, I want to thank our planning partners that helped us to organize this event. And just as background, we wanted to focus on this topic because wetlands provide many valuable ecosystem services, water filtration, flood mitigation, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration. But our goal today is really to highlight the cultural benefits that wetlands provide. In our last session, which you may have attended, we learned about historical and cultural connections between wetlands and Gullah Geechee communities. And we learned about the impacts of wetland modification on the South Carolina landscape as a result of rice culture. Today, our goal is to learn about Indigenous connections to wetlands and how wetland management has changed over time. And we'll wrap up today with an activity to help you put this all in context of your job or other efforts. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Cheryl Cail is the Associate Director for Southeast Conservation at American Rivers and the Vice Chief of the Waccamaw Indian People. So Cheryl, whenever you're ready, you can pull up your presentation.
Okay, and just to clarify, I'm gonna screen share, correct?
Yeah, unless you would prefer me to do it.
That's fine, I can do it. I'm gonna have to probably move this. I'm not sure what you're seeing, if this is,
Yep, we see your slides.
Yes.
Looks good.
okay, and it's, okay, that's really weird. I just clicked on something, so you can only see the slide. I've got things in the way from the Zoom screen.
It looks good on my end.
Okay, all right, double checking. So yes, good afternoon, everybody. As Maeve said, my name is Cheryl Cail. I work in the North Coast in Southeast Conservation for American Rivers. I'm the Associate Director, and I'm also the Vice Chief of the Waccamaw Indian People. And I wanted to share a little bit about cultural history of the wetlands, the significance it has to the impacts to natives, Native Americans in the state of South Carolina. And this is not working for some reason. I might have to ask to do something different because I'm not getting the advanced slide part happening.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, okay, there it is. I think it just
We
came
got
up.
it.
Yes. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you, and it's really an interesting part of our culture, is storytelling. And when we think about the identification of tribes in the state, you can often connect them to the rivers. The map that's on the screen was actually produced by a gentleman who started this about 20 years ago, trying to identify the location of tribal nations. And it is kind of fluid, and you know, he sometimes gets a little bit of flack because somebody will say, well, that's not exactly where they were, but the honest truth is that Native nations moved, and they were moved along with the impacts of settlement and degradation of land that was being used. So just giving you an example of kind of the challenge on that. One of the things, as I said, is storytelling, and Dr. Henry Woodward wrote to John Locke in his letter, November 12th, 1675, and this is found in the correspondence of John Locke, that the only surviving origin story of the coastal natives comes from the southernmost tribe. And if you look on this map, and this is the reason why I'm presenting this map, it's the Eskamacas, and it tells of a great flood that killed all but 2 people who had taken refuge in a cave, where they found a dead bird. And as they plucked its red feathers and blew them into the wind, each feather became a different tribe of Indians with its own language. The 2 survivors gave names to the tribes. The singing of the red bird told them the floodwaters had receded, and in the same way, their people, even if deep in the woods and far from the rivers, would be able to tell if the tide was ebbing or flowing by the notes of the bird song. Through this story, the Eskamacas understood their place in the Indian world of the southern coastal plain. Birds were beings of great spiritual power in southeastern Indian culture, and feathers symbolize that power. Plucked from the same bird, the Eskamacas shared a common origin with neighboring native groups, but as separate feathers. They were differentiated by language, name, and place. And all of them, however, lived by the sea, plying the creeks and the rivers of the islands and obtaining their sustenance from the marshes and the inlets. They were people of the water, intimately connected to the natural rhythms of the coast. So immediately at that point, you can recognize the significance of being nearby water and the significance of reliance on sustenance from the marshes and the inlets. The southeastern natives understood the natural rhythms and migration patterns, and they recognized that estuaries and wetlands provided sustenance for the gathering of large bands of people. And some of the earlier surveyor maps, which we can show here, this historical map collection of David Rumsey collection, is a map of the province of South Carolina from dated about 1773. And it is an interactive map. You can actually go to this site, the David Rumsey collection, and you can view all throughout the region to see what was being surveyed. So this is a survey map, and I happen to pull up an area that I'm particularly fond of, which shows the Black River. And at one point in time, the Waccamaw were living on the south side of the Black River. Again, being moved as settlement came in, they would be moved to different locations or asked to live somewhere else. And trying to keep peace, that was a goal of natives with the colonists. And so they would generally agree to live wherever it was. But in these older maps, you can see demarcations of the interior areas as well, that indicate old Indian fields, abandoned fields, or vacant lands. They weren't really abandoned, but they were simply locations of what was called temporary settlements that were used seasonally for agricultural purposes. So as tribes moved between coastal region to the inland plains, again with that natural rhythm, the migration pattern, kind of like what people do today when they come to the beach, or they come out by nature during different seasons. So seasonally, that would happen for purposes of collecting the sustenance that was available within the marshes and in the bays and tidal marshes. But throughout the state, there's evidence of this through the shell middens that are found in mounds and bluffs, and also burial sites that are found near marshes, bays, and freshwater swamps. And these are all indicative of the intrinsic value that native inhabitants placed on the landscapes. During John Lawson's voyage, it was the native guides who would leave the party and return with wild turkey, deer, hickory nuts, berries, and other provisions that could be found in and near the wetlands, and the forested wetlands particularly. But it was not only recognizing the immense availability of the biodiversity for humans and wildlife, the wetland ecosystems represented a connection for indigenous people between life and death, beginnings and endings. So gathering there, they would come to marry, they would also come to bury their dead, and that was symbolic of that natural rhythm. So just as this ebb and flow of water moves over the land to create habitat for so many migratory species, native people understood nature and followed the same pattern. So the loss of this culturally significant habitat was a result of, and I'm sure if you've been on the other previous sessions, you've already heard about what the value was for colonists. Europeans viewed swamps as having very little economic value. They saw them as navigational barriers, as they were attempting to use navigation by way of planked boats, and accessing trade routes. So they were not considered something as of value. And it was the adaptation by Europeans of the dugout canoes that were actually forged from birch bark and cedar trees of the swamps by the natives, that made it possible for expanded settlement and trade to occur. But the majority of settlements were established along the rivers, and with the expansion of settlement occurring, the wetlands were also threatened. And colonists also viewed the swamps as obstructions to the development of plantations for the cultivation of crops, such as tobacco, corn, and cotton. In the late 1600s to the early 1700s, about that time frame, as settlement was continuing from the low country up into the north coast, that is when rice became the gold standard for Carolina planters. And it does show in the historical records, the first notable record authorizing the draining of Caw Swamp, that was 1754, but it's known that this swamp drainage was occurring well before that. With the rise of rice plantations, it was already in practice. American author Judy Carney writes in her book Black Rice this process that was developed to create rice fields. And this is what you're seeing here. So they have these steps. Step one, the trees are removed, so deforestation. An embankment is built around the acre and the canal is dug around the outside of the embankment. That the changes to the land allow the swamp to be drained of water. Step 2, quadrant, 1/4 of the field is again surrounded by an earthen dike and a trunk is inserted. And then step 3 and 4, the process is repeated until the whole acre is planted with rice. So the wetlands, they ended up becoming landscapes of value with the increase of rice as Carolina gold. But the draining of the swamps for cultivation of rice crops, it not only caused significant degradation of habitats for many species, but it also vastly contributed to the spread of disease among enslaved Native Americans. Additionally, it also gave rise to an increased number of West African people being enslaved and forced to work in the rice fields, since the ability to withstand the disease impacts were better. Enslaved Native Americans did not make good rice workers, field workers. So many enslaved natives worked moving the rice on the trading routes rather than on in the actual fields. Then later, when the timber industry came into play, with boat building being prevalent during the late 1700s into the early 1800s, you had a lot of colonists that would come into the area because of the vast forested wetlands, and they would literally make the said swamp navigable for the floating of timber by removing the timber. And the impacts that this had on the biodiversity may never be fully understood. So one particular and meaningful area that this has occurred is in Horry County, and this is on the land that is part of the Waccamaw tribal grounds, and it was also inhabited by my ancestors, referred to as the Demery settlement. This petition that you're seeing in 1844 was to clear Chinner Swamp, and Chinner Swamp is at the backside of actually surrounds our tribal grounds. It runs out to the Little Petey River and it connects there. And there's not a lot of understanding today of how wetlands are culturally and spiritually significant to Indigenous people. Wetlands have long shown us the connection between people, waters, nature with its rhythms and what we call the mysteries. It's a precipice between life and death, physical and spiritual. And when you look at these incredible mysteries through the lens of science, you actually miss out on that deeper meaning of how we fit into this world. So do we move with the rhythms that are a natural part of the world, or attempt to control, manage, or destroy what is seen as an obstacle? From the physical science lens of cultural history, we refer to what archaeologists uncover. And let me go to the next slide, because I want to give you evidence of this as being a spiritual practice, and how significant it is even today. I don't want to make this about what used to be. We offer a spirit plate. That is our Waccamaw firekeeper, Marion Craddock, offering a spirit plate at the edge of Chinner Swamp on the tribal grounds. And that's a practice that's done anytime there's a meal served. And we consider that as just a normal practice, because we recognize that the land around us and that we see in the physical world, there's also a spiritual world around us. So we're making the connection by actually offering up that spirit plate. Well, one of the other things I wanted to address is that there are numerous archaeological sites that have been identified. The Army Corps of Engineers have viewed this, and they say that in South Carolina, it's the second most abundant resource type in the planning reach. So when they're looking at planning, they recognize archaeological sites And these sites are scattered through, and by the way, there's about 1,290 that are identified. They're scattered throughout this planning reach, but they're concentrated to proximity to rivers, creeks, streams, and marshes. And the highest concentration of archaeological sites are found in Georgetown County, with that being 615. And these sites are located near the Waccamaw River, or the highest concentration of sites are located near the Waccamaw River that date to both prehistoric and historic periods. So on the, I say the science side of it, or the historic cultural history side of it, they're significant. But the interest in the preservation of wetlands, that has increased because the value of wetlands has become more fully understood scientifically. The cultural significance for Indigenous people has not been fully understood. What we see them as a connection to our past and a connection to the natural world around us. And we engage with it on a basis, as I said, with offering up the spirit plate at every meal. I'd like to thank you for participating in this webinar, and I will hand it back over to Maeve to finish up. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you, Cheryl. So we're going to hold questions until the end of the next presentation, but if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A and then we'll come back to it. All right, we'll keep on moving. Our next presenter is the director of the Baruch Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science and a professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University. Mažeika, whenever you're ready, you can come on screen and share your presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Well, good afternoon. I'm actually in the Pacific time right now. Let me go ahead and put my camera on here.
And Mažeika, we're seeing your desktop.
I know you are.
Okay.
I have to start the presentation, but I want to get the camera on first. Let's not. Let me do this first. Let me try this a different way. There we go. Good morning, everybody. Let's try it this way. Once I did it, I lost the, so I have two screens. So you're going to see my desktop just for a moment with all sorts of random files on it. And then I will go ahead and get the presentation on there. But as I do that, I would just say I really enjoyed Cheryl's presentation. That was fantastic. Thank you. Okay, how's that?
Looks good.
All right. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Yeah, again, my name is Mažeika. I am at the Baruch Institute, as is Amy, and I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to just, introduce myself briefly by saying at the Baruch Institute, we have a few different focus areas. One of them is on watersheds, wetlands, and wildlife. And so this is great to be having this opportunity to interact with you all this morning. I am primarily an ecologist, but I do have degrees in anthropology and Native American studies, and the intersection of those spaces is somewhere that I work quite a bit. And so it was a pleasure to be invited to speak with you all about some of the cultural values of wetlands and how they've shifted over time. And I think my hope is that this presentation links well with a lot of the great and very meaningful information that Cheryl just shared with us. And so my sort of task today and my hope is to share with you all a bit about how mainstream societal views in the United States have shifted over time, and how that's related to wetlands conservation, and how we think about protecting wetlands. And there's a lot of factors to this, and it's very complex. Cheryl talked very eloquently about Native American linkages and relationships with wetlands, and the mainstream society, and Cheryl mentioned this too, I think in a broader context, have come to value wetlands in certain ways over time, which was not something certainly in early US history that was the case. So historical events, technological innovations, what we collectively value as a society, and really economic stability or instability is another really important part of how wetlands have been protected and managed. And wetlands have, these values have changed over time. And, certainly, you can equate it to some degree as a bit of a swinging pendulum. And I'll talk a little bit towards the end of the time I have with you about some of the recent swings. But I would say, and again, Cheryl mentioned this, that over time, interest in the preservation of wetlands from a mainstream standpoint has increased as the ecosystem services have become more widely known. Before I do that, and sort of as a segue, Cheryl talked about the high value and cultural values of wetlands for Native Americans. One of the pieces that I just want to stress there, and I think this is something that's just really critical, is that the diversity of Indigenous peoples, of course, across, and my talk's a little bit broader. It talks about South Carolina, but also my goal is to think about this in sort of a national level. But the peoples are just are incredibly diverse. And when we talk about Native Americans and these cultural values, it's important to talk about both the past and the present. And I think the Waccamaw tribes is a great example there. And something that I wanted to kind of look as a segue is, the work in this space is really exciting. I'm actually speaking to you from the Coeur d'Alene Reservation in northern Idaho, or what the tribe would say is today northern Idaho, right? And so, and we're working on a project funded by NOAA in collaboration with the tribe to think about how we can restore and study wetlands using both Indigenous knowledge as well as Eurocentric sort of Western science, in terms of using wetlands to buffer drought. As we know, climate patterns are shifting, and we've seen in a lot of areas in this country, particularly in the West, in this continent, increasing periods of low precipitation and really high heat and increasing drought. And in the context here is that 65% of the wetlands once found in the Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation have been lost since Indian settlement of the area in the 1800s. So a lot of work to be done, but an exciting project that's really about building tribal capacity around drought resilience and a wonderful collaboration. And so as we think about the history of the United States and wetlands, and we start, and I'm going to go through, and I only have very little time with you, so I'm going to do this in big blocks. I would say that there's a fellow scientist, Dr. Thomas Dahl, who has done a lot of work on the cultural progression of wetlands, and a lot of what I'm drawing in the next several slides anywhere are directly from his work. And I want to acknowledge him, but also say that if you're interested in this further, you can, when you look at this presentation, there'll be a link in there, and you can kind of go in and get more information. But when we think of the 1600s through the 1800s and colonial settlement, certainly in the eastern US and beyond, there's just a period of great change. And as Cheryl mentioned, even using the same words, which is great, and we didn't coordinate this, so this works out well. A lot of the settlers and Europeans, Western Europeans primarily, moving in this area, were calling these areas wastelands or dismal swamps. And again, as Cheryl referenced, they were hard to get through, and they were not productive in Europe, in Western European eyes. And so it really led to a lot of efforts to remove wetlands from the landscape. And that happened over time in multiple ways. And as you can see from this map, this is just a map of the estimated extent of South Carolina's original wetlands. And I unfortunately couldn't find a great map that actually showed them by comparison right in this today, but I will tell you later on that we've lost close to 30% of the historic wetlands in South Carolina. And that actually is a much better situation than many other areas in the country. But, wetland drainage and modification started to become widespread, certainly as traditional farms were replaced with subsistence agriculture and replaced by plantations. And then, as Cheryl mentioned too, a bit of an overlap here, but in 1754, South Carolina officially authorized the drainage of the Kaw Swamp. But of course, as we know, that had been going on for quite some time. As we start to think about what happened in broader scales, the period between 1800 and 1860 was really a time of great growth for the nation, and a lot of that came through numerous land acquisitions. So there was the Louisiana Purchase in the 1803. Sorry, I just think of that for a moment. And then Florida and Eastern Louisiana was ceded by Spain in 1819. And of course, we had the annexation of Texas from Mexico in the mid 1800s, the Oregon Compromise also in the mid 1800s. So we're really adding a lot of land mass to the U.S. And then additional land ceded by Mexico in the mid 1800s as well. So not only did we have land growth, but we also had population growth during that time. And so with that newly acquired and land for the U.S., and again, as Cheryl mentioned, this was at the expense of Native peoples. This was a time of rapid inland movement of settlers westward into really wetland-rich areas. Initially, particularly into the Ohio River, Mississippi River valleys. And so we started to see this larger scale convergence of wetlands to farmlands. And if you can see in this map, the areas that are shaded are those that were really where we saw notable wetland loss between 1800 and 1860. And there's a lot of examples of this. And one of the pieces that accelerated this was the American Civil War, which was in the early 1861 to 1865. And this became a point where both armies, the North and the South, really struggled moving through wetland areas. And that sort of propagated and really put pressure on for the design and engineering and construction of transportation and communication networks that really, eliminated a lot of wetlands. And so there are a few examples here. One I wanted to highlight is the Great Black Swamp of Ohio. And that used to be, it was a major barrier to settlement in that area. It was a forested wetland. It was estimated to have been roughly the size of Connecticut before drainage. And today that is all but gone. It used to connect to Lake Erie, and there's just an incredibly important natural resource that has been completely drained and tiled and moved into agricultural land. But there are a lot of other examples: prairie pothole wetlands of western Minnesota and the northern plains, bottomlands of Missouri and Arkansas, delta wetlands in Mississippi and Louisiana, the Gulf Plains of Texas. All these are really examples of how agricultural expansion, in particular in the late second half of the 1800s, really started to eliminate wetlands at much larger scales across the landscape. And technology was a big part of this. As new kinds of machinery increased the ability to till more land and to change the landscape, the ability to remove wetlands more quickly, more rapidly, and at larger scales increased as well. And that went from, of course, horse to tractor to in advances in engineering and other sorts of technological advances. And so, what we're really talking about here are locks, dams, canals, water diversion, all these sorts of practices that removed water from the landscape and allowed wetlands then to be drained and converted into agricultural land. That was during this period too, when we started to see organized drainage districts. And many of you, and for example, Florida is a good example where there are many drainage districts that are organizational units around managing water. A good example of change during this time was the Central Valley in California, which was a major change in the landscape. The rivers of the California Central Valley historically flooded in winter and spread over broad expanses of the valley and the delta, right? Creating these really massive seasonal wetlands that were estimated at one point to be about 4 million acres in the 1850s. And they provided just tremendous amount of ecosystem services, provisioning of biodiversity, were a haven for over 60% of the Pacific flyway waterfowl populations as well. And of course, have been used by indigenous peoples time immemorial. And so these were drained, channelized, dammed, and today we have about 9% of remaining wetlands in California as a whole. So major changes brought about by a combination of factors, but certainly technology was a major player.
Hey, Mažeika, we want to wrap up in the next 2 to 3 minutes.
So as we think about shifting values, as the 1960s, we saw that most incentive programs to drain or destroy wetlands had already been established. And I give it a couple examples here. But as we start to get into the 1970s, we start to really see that increasing mainstream awareness of the values of wetlands. And there were numerous programs that reflect this. The Swamp Buster program, National Wildlife Refuges were enacted earlier, but started to really protect wetlands. One of the key ones, and where I want to end the talk, is really around the Clean Water Act, which came into play. It was actually called the Federal Pollution Control Act of 1972, but that's what transited into what we see today as the Clean Water Act. And that is our main way of protecting wetlands. Sorry, I want to advance one more, and it's just slowing me up here a little bit. There we go. And so as you see across the map, this is the percentage of wetland loss across the country. And as I mentioned before, South Carolina has lost about 27, 30% almost, but some states and many areas have lost over 80 or 90%. And the Clean Water Act is at a federal level that the act that really allows us to protect wetlands. And the goal of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the USA's waters. But within that, the Clean Water Act does not protect every water. Only waters of the U.S., which are decided by a rule called the WOTUS rule, are those that actually protect certain waters. And so while traditional navigable waters, large lakes, streams, rivers, coastal waters have always been protected, a lot of streams, wetlands, for example, have received varying degrees of protection over time. And this is an area I've been highly involved in, and that's based a lot on the understanding that waters are connected. And so if you look at this map, for example, you can see all different types of water bodies, including wetlands, being connected integrally, hydrologically, biologically, chemically to downstream waters. And of course, we know this connectivity exists from the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where we have lots of nutrients pouring in from farmland across the Mississippi Basin. And the public recognized this. I was at the Atlanta airport a few months ago, and we could see the sign saying, look, protect our water, right? And understanding that the effects of Atlanta flow downstream. But where we are today is in an unfortunate place. And this is where I want to end, simply saying that what you're seeing here, and this is just a draft for some work I'm doing, but there have been many rules that define which waters are protected under the Clean Water Act, even in the last 15 to 20 years. And there's a recent decision at the Supreme Court level, which was Sackett versus the EPA, that has stifled and really removed the protection for most wetlands in the United States. And this is just a grave concern in terms of how we think about wetland protection. So as I conclude, attitudes around wetlands have shifted over time and are linked to conservation and policy. Traditionally, this is really an important point. Land has been considered as private property and water as public property. But because wetlands are not only land, but land and water, regarding them simply as real property with no other consideration has been a fundamental error in paradigm. And this is from an environmental historian. The majority of U.S. policies address wetlands in terms of their potential impacts on other areas of public value, particularly clean water and private property, not on the wetland itself. And this latest Sackett ruling from the Supreme Court has fundamentally altered wetland protection and swung the pendulum against conservation. And I just was on a interview about this, and if you're interested in checking it out and learning a little bit more, it was myself and an environmental lawyer. You could direct yourselves there. Otherwise, it was quick. Hopefully I got across some valuable information. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mažeika. And you actually managed to address the question in the Q&A. So I think for now, we're gonna keep on moving, but we'll let people think. And if you have more questions, go ahead and put them in the box and we can circle back. So thank you again to both our speakers. And I am just gonna quickly pull up our next talk. All right. So we're going to wrap up with an activity because we've learned all of this background information about wetlands and cultural connections. We want to help you put that in context and give you a tool that can help you to apply it in your work or your other efforts. All right, so the first thing that I want to say before we jump into stakeholder identification is that stakeholder is a term with many definitions. There's no official definition. If this is a totally new term for you, the conventional definition usually refers to someone who has a stake in a matter. It's someone who is involved, impacted, or is responsible for a project or issue. It's anyone who should have a seat at the table, pretty much. All right, just checking. So increasingly, there's an understanding that stakeholder is an overused term and it might have some baggage that goes along with it. For example, the word stakeholder or end user might indicate a one-way relationship of using a resource instead of like a reciprocal relationship between people and the environment. It also might not encourage a reciprocal relationship between decision makers and stakeholders, such as that incorporation of Indigenous traditional knowledge that Cheryl and Mažeika both mentioned. So we don't have a perfect alternative term, but some examples that I've heard that might feel more true for you could be team member, project proponent, local knowledge or expertise holder, allies, or partners. For today, we are going to use stakeholder and end user, but with those limitations in mind. Okay, so you should have received a link to the stakeholder analysis worksheet. If you were able to print that out ahead of time, go ahead and have it handy. And if you're looking off a computer and don't already have that open, we're going to put a link in the chat right now so you can pull that up in another tab. This resource is available through NOAA's Digital Coast, which is an online hub to support the coastal management community. The Digital Coast provides data as well as tools, training, and information to make those data useful. So this is just a resource that I accessed on the internet. And I want to point out that you might be approaching this exercise as a decision maker, like there's an issue or a project where you're responsible for incorporating stakeholder engagement in your work, or you would like to start doing so. Maybe you work in wetland ecosystems, or you're a researcher and you want to think more about human connections to that place. Or the flip side, you might be thinking about an issue where you don't have formal decision-making power, but it affects you. You might be a stakeholder. If that's the case, as we work through this exercise, try to identify the organizations or agencies that are involved in your issue of concern. What do you know about them? What is their decision-making process? Are there opportunities to engage? What's the most effective way to communicate to those entities? You might be a bit of both, decision maker or a stakeholder, but you should come at this at whatever angle makes the most sense to you. So, okay, looking at the top of the handout, we can see that the goal of this handout is to address a community issue, right? So I actually want to pause here and give you a minute to think about what this means for you. This could be something related to wetlands or cultural connections, but just take a minute and think, what is the issue or project that you are focused on, and where are you focused? What is the geographic scope? So just take a quick pause, 1 minute. What is your focus issue? Where are you focused? Okay, that was a quick minute, but I hope that you were able to jot down some thoughts. Since we only have a short amount of time, we're going to practice using this tool by walking through an example. After the webinar, I hope you'll take some time to revisit the brainstorming that you just did and think about how you could apply this tool in your work. Okay, so we're going to put the tool into action with an example. Our example project is purely hypothetical, but we wanted to represent a realistic scenario for coastal South Carolina, and we wanted it to touch on a number of different stakeholders and wetland ecosystem services. So in this case, I am imagining that I work for some municipality, maybe a city or county government, and we have a property in an area that is known for having issues with flooding and water quality. So our goal for the property is to 1, restore wetland habitat, 2, provide public access, and 3, provide water quality and quantity benefits. A project like this has the potential to impact many people within the community, so I want to get a sense of who those stakeholders might be and what is important to them. So I'm not going to read all of this. You're going to get these slides after the webinar, but this is the first page of the handout, and as I sit down to think about my project, I'm going to be following the prompts on the left-hand side of the table to help me identify who might be a stakeholder at all the different stages of the project. So some stakeholders that came to mind are those who are or will be directly affected. That might be neighboring residents of the property, historic or existing user groups, or future visitors. Those who have resources or skills that may be needed. I'm doing a wetland restoration, so I'm going to need environmental engineers or scientists. I'm going to be engaging stakeholders, so I should reach out to boundary spanning groups such as the reserves or South Carolina Sea Grant or Clemson Extension that can help to facilitate those interactions. I could reach out to archaeological, historical, or cultural groups to better understand the history of that place and make connections with relevant contacts. And then we have those who might oppose or support the process. So that might be local residents, if they're worried about traffic or safety, or there's going to be snakes in the wetland, or it might be people who hope to access that property in the future. But what I want to point out is that some of these stakeholders are sort of defined by someone's job title, right? Like those with decision-making authority. I came up with elected officials because that's sort of baked into their role. But some of these are sort of defined by attitudes. So those who oppose or support the process, those aren't fixed categories. And I think a big thing that affects that is trust. So you could have someone who is initially a supporter, but if that relationship isn't fostered and maintained by stakeholder engagement, they could become someone opposed, and vice versa. You could bring a skeptical person on board. So one thing to keep in mind when using this tool is that these prompts are meant to help you be thorough and intentional about identifying stakeholders. But we don't always know what we don't know, and you might miss someone who should be at the table. So I can share an example of an approach to get around this. Last year, the Ace Basin and North Inlet Winyah reserves were planning a workshop on marsh management. And we started off by brainstorming a list of stakeholders using these prompts as a guide. But then we reached out to partners and the stakeholders we identified and asked them to add anyone else that they think should be part of the conversation too. So we were kind of like crowdsourcing everyone else that we didn't think of to sort of fill in those gaps and cover those blind spots. It's not a perfect approach, but it's definitely helps. All right, so this is going to be page 2 of the handout. This is stakeholder analysis. So once we've identified stakeholders, we want to better understand them. And just a warning, this is a good first step, but you should be careful not to make assumptions and build on this through relationships. So for the stakeholders that we already identified in this left-hand column, it asks us questions about them to sort of understand their role in the project. So elected officials, their interests are likely to be things like budgets, community needs. It's a win if the community is on board and the project is within its budget. Level of involvement really depends for all of these stakeholders, but I made a special note that elected officials might not be directly involved in planning or implementation, but their support is essential. Like that's a key thing to know about this stakeholder group. You can do that for all these different stakeholders, environmental engineers, they bring technical expertise, but they might have like schedule limitations and they're going to care about things like benefits for ecosystems and biodiversity. Future users are likely to care about access that fits their needs or wants, and that could be things like boating, disc golf, school trips, picnics, hiking, and they might bring special interest expertise to help you plan those aspects of your project. Historical or traditional users, that could be underserved communities, indigenous groups, natural resource businesses. These are groups that might be more concerned with maintaining populations of important species. And that might mean special types of habitat management. It could mean agreements about access to the property so that they can continue to use those resources. It might mean options for input outside of typical processes like business hour meetings. The engagement should really be tailored to the needs of the stakeholders. And the last note is that there might be groups that weren't historic users, but that might reflect environmental justice issues. And so engagement might involve addressing those concerns. Okay, I know that was a whirlwind, but just to wrap up, some tips for stakeholder success. Crowdsource with partners and existing stakeholders to fill in gaps when identifying who should be involved. Be careful with stakeholder analysis, avoid making assumptions, and build relationships. Keep the door open throughout the process. Ideally, there shouldn't be just one and only opportunity to provide input. Hopefully, throughout a project or an issue, there are opportunities for new stakeholders to get involved and multiple opportunities for input. And finally, work with a trusted facilitator to coordinate engagement and discussions. This can help with capacity. This can help with building and maintaining relationships. And that is all I had. So I think I'll wrap up there, and we can use all our remaining time for Q&A for not just myself, but any of our speakers. And I'm going to look at what we have in the Q&A box. All right, I see a few people were typing questions that we responded to. Not seeing other ones come in. So I think what I'll do is just pull up our slides with a few concluding remarks. All right, so the first thing that I want to express is just a huge thank you to our speakers for sharing their time and their knowledge, and also a huge thank you to everyone who attended. Again, if you are planning to get a certificate for continuing education credits, you are going to need to fill out the evaluation survey. And even if you are not getting credits, I definitely appreciate if everyone would fill out that survey. The feedback that I get really helps me to plan future programs and education opportunities. So the link to that is going to be in the chat. And when you complete that survey, you'll have a link to download the certificate where you can fill in your name and submit it to your association. Probably not tomorrow, but by the end of the week, you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording and some additional resources. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. And with that, I just want to say thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great day.